I quote from Classic FM on English music. From the works of Renaissance masters like William Byrd and John Dowland to the indomitable Edward Elgar and Ralph Vaughan Williams, it's an unignorable contribution. Unignorable perhaps, but it is rather ignoring an enormous gap in the musical record. A 200-year sized gap, when this sceptred isle, produced for the classical world, pretty much diddly squat. So bad was the situation that we had to hire in help. London had the money to attract Handel for life. Haydn, Mozart, Mendelssohn and others also came for the paycheck. But the question remains, why did English music itself disappear for 2 centuries? Personally, I think this is a crime scene. The murder of English music. And I have a prime suspect who also just happens to be a composer and whose identity I shall reveal soon. Firstly, let's deal with some of the usual suspects I uncovered during my in-depth research. These come in 3 main areas. Suspect 1. The Brits are just not very good with music. Well, I must protest. Renaissance composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd were amongst the finest in Europe, and behind them a whole host of talented writers like John Dowland and Thomas Morley, leading us straight into the Baroque with William Purcell, again up there with the very best, until his untimely death in his mid-30s. And then silence, pretty much, until Elgar, Benjamin Britten and Vaughan Williams started making noises at the turn of the 20th century. So the issue isn't quality, the issue is that 200-year gap. Suspect 2. A lack of patronage for musicians in England. And when it existed, it went to foreigners like Handel or Mendelssohn. Sounds a bit like Blame Johnny Foreigner to me. Isn't this a classic case of cause and effect confusion? The reason the British public was so keen to lure foreign composers like Haydn or J.C. Bach in was that we had so little homegrown talent to amuse our own ears. And finally, suspect 3. There's always been great music here, it's just that we've never noticed it. I've come across this argument a few times, including links to this impressive Wikipedia list of English composers. Only, who are most of them? And in any case, when you compare the size of the lists for this period, there are way less composers. There may have been English music in this gap, but there was far less and the quality was far worse. So yes, these explanations are far too charitable. You see, I believe this is a whodunit. I think there's a culprit with blood on his hands who is also a composer. I mean the man who supposedly composed... Of course I'm referring to Henry VIII. He didn't compose Greensleeves, by the way, but he did play and compose music. He also murdered 2 of his 6 wives and executed over 50,000 people. This was the man who replaced Catholicism in England with Protestantism, along the way deciding that hundreds of the nation's religious institutions should be dissolved, i.e. destroyed. And the monasteries were destroyed, their beauty and art plundered. Each religious house had its own choir, and usually an organist. Hundreds of musicians lost their livelihood, and even worse, thousands and thousands of pages of music were destroyed, including hundreds of masses, motets and magnificats. This was a catastrophe for England's ecclesiastical music, and one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism enacted on our shores. This set about a process of decay, a process that took time. We were still producing good composers 50 years after Henry's death, but the ground which cultivated them was becoming barren. It would take a couple of 100 years to recover. Thomas Tallis was Catholic and William Byrd converted to Catholicism. When Byrd dies in 1623, Latin church music pretty much dies in this country with him. As Catholicism was banned from our shores, a more austere form of Protestantism took hold of England. Colour, and I suspect popish polyphony, was banished from our churches. The visual arts suffered too. Is it any coincidence that England produced no painters of note until the 19th century? And is it any coincidence that from this period, the English Renaissance to the 20th century, England became a country of words? First Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Keats, Byron, Shelley, our arts became concentrated on verse and staged drama. And the idea. English, indeed British science, exploded onto the scene in this time, very much the vanguard of the scientific revolution. But music? Alas, thanks I believe to Henry, that overweight, overrated lump of bad royalty, and his son King Edward, we would have to spend a couple of centuries borrowing and hiring from the continent. Well, that's my theory anyway. No doubt, as always in history and life, there is in actuality a complex raft of historical reasons, particularly on a subject as large as this. But talking about large subjects, at the risk of body shaming, I'll still hold to my original and rather large prime suspect. Thank you and subscribe.